The worn backpack slid slightly against the worn denim of her knee, revealing a glimpse of faded embroidery. An eagle, barely visible under the strap. Serafina Vance settled into seat 12F, her gaze fixed on the storm-darkened window, but her mind was riven by a memory far sharper than the present moment. The roar of engines and the agonizing weight of a decision made in a night sky lit only by trace of fire. She looked like a student, perhaps a traveler too poor to afford comfort, judged silently by the sleek, self-assured figures surrounding her in the business cabin. But they knew nothing of the classified vault where her file rested, nor the missions she had flown for elite commandos. As the plane hummed toward the capital city, she grasped the edge of her seatbelt, a small, controlled motion, a nervous habit she had never shaken since the time she brought 3 squadrons home alive from chaos. And then, the pilot's voice crackled, announcing an unexpected landing at the military hub of Fort Valor Airfield. Serafina's posture shifted, subtle but immediate, her eyes sharpened. She knew that airfield. She knew the sentinels standing guard outside the window, the Phantom Wing F-22s. Her hand tightened around the water bottle, waiting for a confrontation that only she knew was coming, ready to face the ghosts of her past that were about to materialize in a business-class cabin. The noise and rush of the Cascade terminal had been a muted blur, but stepping onto the packed flight bound for the capital city, Serafina Vance felt the stairs sharpen, piercing through the noise. Her faded gray hoodie, a comfortable shield, felt suddenly exposed. The cuffs were frayed from years of use, and the small tear on her jeans seemed to draw every eye. She moved down the narrow aisle, meticulously avoiding the expensive carry-ons that looked like trophies lining the business-class path. A woman in a sharp blazer, whose earrings flashed under the cabin lights, glanced up from her device and gave a quick, dismissive smirk. Across the aisle, Victor Thorne, a man in a perfectly knotted pinstriped suit, leaned toward his seatmate. His voice just loud enough to cut through the ambient chatter. "Looks like she got lost on her way to the bus station," he observed, his tone laced with soft mockery. Serafina didn't flinch. Her steps remained even, her dark, wavy hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, revealing a bare, unadorned face. She wasn't seeking validation. She just needed to get to the capital city. She slid into 12F, the window seat, tucking her worn army green backpack under the seat in front. It was an old thing, bearing the mark of a base she hadn't seen in years. The man beside her, Victor Thorne, smelled of expensive, overwhelming cologne, and his Rolex screamed new money. He gave her a rapid once-over, dismissing her as quickly as he had judged her attire. Serafina had learned long ago to let such judgment wash off her. To the casual observer, she might have been a college student struggling financially, maybe someone who'd snagged a last-minute, deeply discounted ticket. But the truth, locked deep within a classified vault, listed Serafina not merely as a reserve recruit, but as a pilot of unparalleled skill. It carefully omitted the missions she'd executed for SEAL Team 6, or the secretive discharge that followed under circumstances no one was authorized to whisper about. As she settled, Dahlia Hayes, a young woman in a sleek black dress with impeccably styled hair, leaned over from the row behind. Dahlia's voice carried a practiced sweetness that completely failed to reach her eyes. "You must be so excited to be on a plane like this," she offered, her tone dripping with pity, as if Serafina were a charity case who had never experienced air travel. Several heads turned, catching the comment, and a soft ripple of superior laughter spread through the cabin. Serafina's fingers paused momentarily on the cap of her water bottle. She turned slightly, meeting Dahlia's gaze for a brief, weighty moment. "It's just a flight," Serafina replied, her voice quiet but possessing the unmistakable resonance of a stone dropping into still, deep water. Dahlia's manufactured smile momentarily faltered, and she abruptly sat back, flipping her perfect hair in irritation. Serafina returned her focus to the window, her expression unchanged, but her grip tightened just enough to slightly crease the plastic water bottle. The first direct jab landed even before the aircraft began taxiing. Cassandra Steele, the head flight attendant, stood at the front of the business cabin. She was in her 40s, impeccably uniformed, with sharp eyes that instantaneously assessed and judged the worth of every passenger. She had taken one look at Serafina's boarding information and mentally assigned her place. Economy class in the back, but today the plane's full, so you'll just have to sit here, Cassandra stated, her voice laced with a faint, chilling disdain, which elicited chuckles from a few of the surrounding business class passengers. Victor Thorne, the man in the pinstriped suit, leaned further toward his colleague, a guy with slick hair and gold cuff links. Probably one of those discount ticket people, Victor stated, making no effort whatsoever to lower his voice. Serafina's fingers paused briefly on her backpack zipper, yet she continued stowing the bag slowly, deliberately, counting her breaths to maintain control. A woman across the aisle, Lorena Pierce, whose nails were painted a glossy, striking red, snickered softly. Serafina never looked up. She merely adjusted her seat belt, her hands remaining completely steady. The plane surged into the sky, the engine's hum settling into a steady, deafening drone. Serafina gazed out the window, watching the endless expanse of clouds. Her hands rested in her lap, showing calluses, the permanent marks from years of gripping flight controls and cockpits that most people in this cabin would never even know existed. Lorena Pierce leaned toward her blonde friend, Bianca Lyle, who smelled heavily of expensive perfume. "Bet she's scared sitting near the emergency exit," Lorena whispered, a sharp smirk cutting across her face. Serafina's lips curved into the faintest, almost imperceptible smile, but she didn't turn her head. She simply reached for her water bottle and unscrewed the cap with a slow, deliberate twist. Bianca laughed, a sharp sound that echoed briefly in the otherwise subdued cabin. Serafina remained quiet, her dark eyes fixed on the distant horizon, as if scanning for something vital that no one else could possibly perceive. During the meal service, Cassandra paused pointedly by Serafina's row, holding a tray of menus exclusively designated for business class. She deliberately glanced at Serafina's faded hoodie before warmly handing a menu to Victor Thorne. "I'm sorry, we only have enough for our premium passengers," Cassandra announced, ensuring her voice carried, her eyes flicking to Serafina with the unmistakable hint of superiority. A man in a tailored blazer 2 rows ahead turned back, his laugh low and mocking. "Don't worry, she's probably used to fast food," he sneered, his voice dripping with practiced amusement. A ripple of chuckles followed, and Serafina's hand, resting on her water bottle, stilled. She looked up, her eyes meeting Cassandra's for a charged moment. "Water's fine," she said, her voice soft, yet resonating with the finality of a line irrevocably drawn in the sand. Cassandra blinked, clearly caught off guard by the quiet conviction, and moved on, her heels clicking faster than before. Serafina leaned back, her fingers tapping once, a tiny, controlled motion against the armrest, a gesture that contained more unspoken discipline than any shouted retort. Hours drifted past, the cabin settling into the expected rhythm of hushed conversations and the clinking of glasses. Serafina continued to sip her water, her movements precise, indicative of someone highly trained to maintain perfect composure under pressure. Victor Thorne, next to her, repeatedly glanced in her direction, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher her true identity. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with blatant condescension. "You look like you're headed to a job interview or something. Hope you've got a better outfit in that bag," he challenged. Serafina slowly turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "I'm good," she responded, her voice low and utterly steady, like a blade sliding smoothly into its sheath. Victor blinked, momentarily thrown off by her lack of reaction, and muttered something dismissive about kids these days, before retreating to his tablet. Serafina turned back to the window, her face unreadable, but she instinctively brushed the edge of her seat belt, adjusting it ever so slightly. The captain's voice cut through the established monotony over the intercom. "Folks, we're making a quick stop at Fort Valor Airfield for refueling. Shouldn't be long," the voice announced. Serafina's head lifted slightly. Her dark eyes immediately sharpened as she scanned the military runway coming into view. Sleek jets lined the tarmac, their shapes glinting under the sunlight, and military personnel moved below with visible purpose. Her fingers tightened around her water bottle for a single brief second before she consciously set it down. Cassandra, standing nearby, noticed the abrupt, subtle shift in Serafina's entire posture. "Something catch your eye?" she asked, her tone heavy with suspicion rather than mere curiosity. Serafina did not answer right away. She continued to look out, her hands resting in her lap, observing something that only she seemed able to see. As the plane began its descent toward the military base, a businessman in a crisp white shirt stood to retrieve a bag. He glanced at Serafina, then spoke loudly, clearly addressing the entire cabin. "Some people just don't know their place, do they?" he said, his voice carrying a smug, knowing edge. A few passengers nodded, their smiles tight. Serafina's eyes flicked to him, just a momentary recognition, before returning to the window. She shifted in her seat, her backpack sliding marginally against her leg. "I know where I am," she stated, her voice so quiet that it barely reached him. Yet, the quiet weight of her conviction made him freeze. He cleared his throat, suddenly overly focused on his overhead bag, and sat down without another word. The cabin grew strangely quieter, the air thick with unspoken tension. Arthur Finch, a man in business class with a loosened tie and a loud, confident grin, leaned over his seat. He was used to being the loudest presence in any room. "What, do you want to fly a plane?" he challenged, his laughter sharp and mean. A few people chuckled, their laughter like pointed needles in the air. Serafina turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto his. "I've worked near planes before," she said, her voice completely calm but firm like a closing door. Arthur Finch's grin faltered, and he shifted uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by his drink. Cassandra raised an eyebrow but refrained from comment. She moved down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply, almost marking the moment. When the plane finally touched down at Fort Valor Airfield, the cabin's energy instantly shifted. The business class passengers straightened their jackets and checked their devices, anticipating a brief return to their executive lives. Cassandra's voice returned over the intercom, crisp and entirely professional. "A few select passengers have been invited to meet the Phantom Wing pilots on the tarmac. Please remain seated unless you've been notified," she instructed. She pointedly glanced at Serafina as she spoke, making it absolutely clear who was excluded from this elite group. Serafina did not move. She simply took another sip of water, her face blank, as if she had anticipated and dismissed this exclusion long ago. Her fingers brushed the edge of her backpack, where the small, faded eagle patch caught the light momentarily before she tucked it back out of sight. Lorena Pierce leaned conspiratorially toward Bianca Lyle, ensuring her voice carried. "They probably don't want pictures with someone dressed like that," Lorena asserted, her laugh calculated and practiced. Bianca nodded, her lips curling into a visible smirk. A quiet chuckle came from the row ahead where Dorian Kent, scrolling through his phone, allowed his smirk to be visible even from Serafina's seat. Serafina didn't look up. She merely screwed the cap back onto her water bottle, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were measuring the passing seconds. The cabin air felt heavy now, thick with a judgment that required no spoken words. As the select, invited passengers gathered their belongings, a woman in a designer coat paused by Serafina's row. Her expensive, sharp floral perfume preceded her. She looked down at Serafina, her eyes narrowing slightly, and spoke to Cassandra in a stage whisper. "You would think they'd screen people better for flights like this," she declared, her voice dripping with pure disdain. Cassandra nodded slightly, her lips pursed, and quickly handed the woman a complimentary beverage. Serafina's hand stilled on her backpack, her fingers grazing the faded eagle patch. She looked up, her steady eyes meeting the woman's for a split second. "Screening's not my problem," Serafina said, her voice low and even, delivering the quiet statement like an unexpected challenge. The woman froze, her drink halfway to her lips, before she quickly hurried back to her own seat. Serafina leaned back, her expression unchanged, but her fingers tapped the armrest once. A small, controlled punctuation mark. Serafina's eyes flicked to the window, where the F-22s stood like dark, powerful sentinels on the tarmac. For a moment, her fingers hovered over the patch on her bag. She had sewn it there herself years ago, following a mission that had left her hands shaking, yet had ensured her entire squadron survived. The memory flashed unbidden. The night sky, illuminated by tracer fire, the roar of massive engines, and the crippling weight of decisions that no one, especially a teenager, should ever have to bear. She blinked, and the sharp memory dissolved. She adjusted her hoodie, pulling the sleeves over her calloused hands, and leaned back in her seat. The cabin's loud chatter now felt distant, like meaningless static on a failing radio. A sudden, commanding presence entered the business-class cabin. Commander Leo Sterling stepped onto the floor, his uniform razor-sharp, his presence arriving like a localized storm. He was in his late 30s, with a severe jawline and keen eyes that seemed to miss absolutely nothing. He politely nodded to the invited passengers, shaking hands with Victor Thorne and Lorena Pierce. But then, his eyes landed on Serafina, sitting quietly in 12F. He froze completely, his hand still loosely gripping the last handshake. The rest of the cabin did not immediately notice, but Serafina did. She met his gaze, her expression perfectly steady, as if she had been awaiting this precise moment all along. Her fingers gently brushed the edge of her seat, a small, grounding motion. Commander Sterling walked directly to her row, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. "Are you Ghost Rider 7? He asked, his voice low, almost reverent in its tone. Serafina gave him a small, succinct nod, her eyes never leaving his. Victor Thorne snorted softly from his seat, clearly believing the entire exchange was an elaborate joke. Commander Sterling's jaw tightened visibly, but he maintained eye contact with Serafina. "My deepest apologies for having you sit here," he said, speaking louder now, ensuring the entire suddenly silent cabin could hear him. "You are invited to the tarmac immediately." Serafina stood without hesitation, slinging her worn backpack over one shoulder. Her movements were smooth and precise, demonstrating the ease of someone who had performed this exact maneuver 100 times under far more critical eyes. The cabin instantly buzzed with whispers, but she did not look back. As Serafina followed Commander Sterling toward the exit, a man in a navy suit, his expensive watch glinting, leaned out of his seat. "This has to be a mistake," he insisted, his voice loud and confident, as if addressing a corporate boardroom. "She doesn't look like anyone important." A few other passengers nodded, their murmurs growing louder and doubtful. Serafina's steps did not falter, but her hand momentarily tightened on her backpack strap, her knuckles whitening. She turned her head slightly, her dark eyes meeting the man's. "Looks can be deceiving," she said, her voice soft yet razor-sharp like silk hiding a blade. The man's mouth opened, then closed abruptly, and he sank back into his seat, his earlier confidence instantly deflated. Commander Sterling's eyes flicked to the man, a brief, silent warning, before he ushered Serafina out. Outside, the air was intensely sharp with the biting scent of jet fuel and high wind. Serafina stepped onto the tarmac, her gray hoodie flapping slightly. The pilots of the Phantom Wing F-22s stood waiting in a perfectly straight line, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. Commander Sterling's voice cut cleanly through the wind-swept silence. "Attention! This is Shadow Serpent, the one who once led 3 squadrons through enemy skies." The pilots instantly snapped to attention, their hands rising in perfect, synchronized unison to deliver a flawless salute. Serafina returned the salute, her movement crisp and professional, her expression calm but warm. A faint, genuine smile tugged at her lips as she lowered her hand. The moment was carried by the wind, and the plane windows filled instantly with the stunned faces of the passengers watching inside. Serafina's eyes briefly flicked to the massive jets, and for a fleeting second, her shoulders subtly softened, as if she had finally returned home. Back on the plane, the atmosphere had drastically shifted. Victor Thorne scoffed, leaning back in his seat. Sounds like a Hollywood story, he dismissed, his voice carrying over the engine hum. Cassandra offered a forced, weak chuckle. Maybe it's just an honorary title, she suggested, smoothing down her immaculate uniform. Bianca Lyle whispered urgently to Lorena. No way it's real. Serafina paid them no mind. She stood near the window, her hands slipped into the pockets of her hoodie, watching the gleaming jets under the bright sun. Commander Sterling's glance toward the airplane cabin was cold, signaling clearly that he had heard every skeptical word. Serafina's fingers brushed the internal edge of her hoodie, a small, grounding motion, before she turned back fully to the tarmac. A younger officer approached, carrying an old flight helmet. It was clearly worn but maintained with care, and the call sign Shadow Serpent was boldly embroidered across the side. Commander Sterling took the helmet and solemnly held it out to Serafina. This helmet is only awarded to a pilot who has completed a top-secret mission, he announced, his voice steady and loud enough for every passenger in the window seats to hear. Serafina accepted the helmet, her fingers tracing the stitching for a moment. Then, with a movements as natural as breathing, she slipped it on. The fit was impeccable, tailored specifically for her. A young pilot, barely in his 20s, stepped forward, his voice low with respect. She's the one who saved my squadron, he stated. The other pilots straightened further, their faces shifting into something approaching awe. As Serafina stood there, helmeted, a junior pilot with a boyish face approached hesitantly, holding a small, weathered logbook, its edges frayed from heavy use. Ma'am, you signed this for me 3 years ago, he said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. He opened the book to a page marked prominently with her call sign, her signature sharp and unmistakable. The surrounding pilots turned, their eyes softening with genuine recognition. Serafina took the logbook, her fingers brushing the page gently. She nodded, her lips pressing into a small, heartfelt smile. You made it through, she said, her voice quiet but warmly encouraging. The young pilot's eyes shone with respect, and he saluted her again. The cabin windows remained crowded with faces, but the atmosphere inside had fundamentally changed, growing heavier with an unspoken collective realization. Serafina stepped back into the cabin, the helmet tucked securely under her arm. The passengers were now profoundly quieter, yet not all were convinced. Cassandra forced an artificial smile, her voice overly polite. Well, it's nice to have a special guest, she chirped, but her eyes instinctively darted to Serafina's scuffed sneakers. Dorian Kent crossed his arms, his voice low but audible. Probably just a PR stunt, he muttered skeptically. Serafina offered no response. She simply inclined her head slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the Shadow Serpent helmet. The cabin was clearly divided, some watching her with intense curiosity, others clinging to their skepticism. She didn't concern herself with either reaction. She settled back into 12F, placing her backpack at her feet, and looked out the window as the aircraft prepared for departure. A younger flight attendant, clearly more nervous than Cassandra, approached Serafina's row. She held out a small, silver eagle pin. This is from the crew. For, your service, she offered, her voice stumbling awkwardly over the words. The cabin fell silent, all eyes fixed on the exchange. Serafina looked at the gleaming pin, then at the attendant's sincerely nervous face. She accepted it with careful fingers and pinned it deliberately onto her worn backpack without speaking a word. The attendant beamed, a genuine smile replacing her nervousness, and quickly hurried back to her post. Dorian Kent shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier smirk completely gone. Serafina leaned back, her eyes fixed on the window. The silver pin glinted faintly next to the faded eagle patch on her pack. The plane began to taxi back onto the runway, preparing for takeoff. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but before he could finish his standard address, another sound cut through. A low, powerful, unmistakable roar. 2 Phantom Wing F-22s suddenly appeared alongside the commercial jet, their massive wings glinting in the sunlight. Commander Sterling's voice crackled over the radio, loud and clear enough to be heard throughout the entire cabin. "Shadow Serpent, we never got to thank you for last time." Seraphina leaned toward the window, a small smile curving her lips. She pressed the headset she had been provided and spoke, her voice steady and controlled. "Hold formation, Eagle 1. The response was instantaneous, a chorus of voices flooding the radio. "Yes, ma'am." The entire cabin went dead silent. Victor Thorne froze, his complimentary drink halfway to his mouth. Lorena Pierce stared at her phone, her finger motionless. Cassandra's forced smile completely vanished, her hands fumbling with an unnecessary tray. No one spoke, paralyzed by the sight. The F-22s maintained their perfect formation, escorting the commercial plane as it powerfully climbed into the sky. Seraphina leaned back in her seat, her eyes fixed on the magnificent jets outside. The cabin was irrevocably changed. No one dared to look at her the same way. Arthur Finch, the loud man with the loosened tie, shifted uncomfortably, his previous bravado entirely gone. Bianca Lyle whispered something to Lorena, but the words were too quiet to discern. Seraphina didn't need to hear it. She had heard more than enough. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, a passenger in a tailored jacket, his face flushed with deep embarrassment, stood up and hesitantly approached Seraphina's row. I didn't know who you were," he stammered, his voice low but audible to those nearby. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier." Seraphina looked up, her eyes steady but not unkind. She gave him a single small, acknowledging nod and turned back to the window. The man stood there for a long moment, his hands fidgeting nervously, before returning slowly to his seat. The cabin felt smaller now, the air charged with an intense mixture of awe and profound shame. Seraphina's fingers lightly brushed the eagle pin on her backpack, a quiet, permanent reminder of precisely who she was. The flight to the capital city felt remarkably shorter after that. The cabin stayed subdued, the earlier lively chatter replaced by an uneasy, respectful hum. Seraphina kept her gaze fixed on the window, watching the two F-22 escorts peel away gracefully as the plane began its final descent. She brushed the patch on her backpack again, the faded eagle catching the cabin light. She remembered earning it at 19, flying a mission so classified that even her immediate team only knew fragments of the scope. Despite the chaos of the sky and the screaming radio orders, she had brought them home, every single one. The memory faded, replaced by the sight of the capital city skyline. When the plane landed, the passengers moved slowly, as if they were still mentally processing the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Seraphina stood, slinging her backpack over her shoulder, the Shadow Serpent helmet tucked beneath her arm. She did not rush, nor did she linger. She simply walked down the aisle, her steps steady, her head held high. Victor Thorne actively avoided her eyes, pressing his phone tightly to his ear and muttering about an urgent meeting. Lorena Pierce was furiously texting, her face notably pale. Cassandra Steele stood by the exit, her smile utterly forced, her hands clasped rigidly in front of her. Seraphina did not look at any of them. She just kept moving, her scuffed sneakers making little sound against the floor. At the arrival gate, a man was waiting. He was tall, quiet, possessing a commanding presence that required no spoken word. His suit was simple but perfectly tailored, and his eyes locked onto Seraphina the exact moment she appeared. He did not speak much, merely nodded once and immediately fell into step beside her. The passengers from the flight, still lingering near the baggage claim, fell instantly silent. Dorian Kent dropped his phone mid-text. His smirk completely vanished. Bianca Lyle looked swiftly away, clutching her silk scarf tightly. Cassandra busied herself with some paperwork, her movements noticeably jerky. No one had to say the man's name. They sensed who he was. It was Elias Vance, Seraphina's husband, a man whose quiet influence reached classified corners and spheres of power that most people couldn't even begin to imagine. Before they reached the terminal exit, a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, tugged anxiously at her mother's sleeve and pointed directly at Serafina. "Is that the pilot lady?" she whispered, her eyes wide with undisguised wonder. The mother, a quiet woman who had remained completely silent throughout the judgmental flight, looked at Serafina and nodded gently. "That's her," she said softly, her voice now full of quiet respect. Serafina caught the girl's eye and offered a small, warm, genuine smile, the kind of smile that indicated she truly saw her. The girl grinned back widely, clutching her mother's hand tighter. Serafina's hand brushed Elias's as they continued walking. The shadow serpent helmet remained under her arm, the silver eagle pin glinting faintly on her pack. The terminal was bustling, yet people subtly parted as the couple passed, as if sensing something far greater than the faded hoodie and scuffed sneakers. The consequences for the detractors began immediately, quiet but entirely relentless. Victor Thorne, the executive in the pinstripe suit, was a mid-level manager at a major defense contractor. Someone on the flight had recorded his snide comments, and the video spread virally online like wildfire. By the following morning, Victor was jobless, his LinkedIn profile completely scrubbed clean. Lorena Pierce, the influencer with the glossy red nails, discovered her latest major sponsorship deal had been abruptly cancelled after the video went viral. Her followers plummeted by thousands overnight, and her hastily published apology post was buried under a deluge of comments calling her out. Cassandra Steele faced a quieter but definitive reckoning, a formal reprimand from the airline for gross unprofessional conduct. She was permanently reassigned to short domestic routes, her long-held dreams of prestigious international flights entirely grounded. Dahlia Hayes's social media presence suffered a massive blow when her company publicly distanced itself from her, citing unprofessional behavior displayed on the flight. Dorian Kent's startup quietly but decisively lost a crucial major investor, the news breaking subtly through industry channels. Bianca Lyle's law firm issued a public statement apologizing for her conduct, and she was immediately sidelined from all high-profile cases. Arthur Finch's consulting firm dropped him from their roster entirely, his name erased from their website before the week was finished. Serafina did not personally witness any of this inevitable fallout. She didn't need to. She had endured far worse challenges than their petty words, missions where the sky was literally on fire, where a single wrong movement meant certain death. This was merely noise, the kind she had trained herself to filter out long ago. She and Elias walked through the terminal, their steps perfectly synchronized, the shadow serpent helmet still held securely under her arm. The capital city skyline loomed outside the glass, a permanent reminder of the true reason she was here, not for the transient recognition of the passengers, but for something far bigger, something that had always been her driving force, even when the world attempted to diminish her. In the end, Serafina stood at the edge of the terminal, her husband silently beside her, the great city stretching out before them. The wind gently tugged at her faded hoodie, but she did not pull it tighter. She stood perfectly steady, just as she had always been. The world had doubted her, mocked her, and tried to force her into a place of insignificance. But she was not small. She never had been. And for anyone who had ever been judged, overlooked, or silenced, her story remained a quiet, firm promise. You're not alone. You never were.